Chapter 55 Fall. A few hours later, BB found himself pacing back and forth in the air outside of his house. Eventide was leaning against the wall by the door with an amused look on his face, though the occasional flickers of worry in his aura caught BB's attention from time to time. It was the middle of the afternoon now, and thick clouds could be seen gathering on the horizon. The sun was still shining, but at the rate the clouds were moving, it would probably be smothered in only a couple of hours. The weather forecast had said there would probably be heavy rain later, something nobody was particularly looking forward to, especially BB. It wasn't that he disliked water, far from it, he loved it. But the same could not be said of his friends and family. When it rained, everyone's moods plummeted, and by extension, so did his, and the quality of his meals. He did his best to ignore that, though, choosing instead to voice his question again.
When is she gonna be here?
Eventide rolled his eyes and shook his head. Oh, I don't know. Last time you asked me was about a minute ago, and I said around 5 minutes, so by process of elimination, I think we can safely say...
Dad!
BB whined pitifully, rotating in the air and puffing up his cheeks at his father's snark.
Not helping!
The man did not seem at all deterred by his son's tone of voice. Well, maybe not, but it also isn't helping to ask me the same question over and over again when I told you the answer already.
But
BB did a backflip in frustration and went back to pacing. Eventide laughed at that, before turning his eyes away. BB huffed quietly to himself, but otherwise said nothing more. Impressively, he was actually able to keep his question contained for more than a minute this time. In fact, he made it to a solid 5 minutes of silence before the urge to ask became too much to bear. With another groan, he spun around and glared daggers at the corner he was waiting on.
Oh, is she here yet? Yep, I'm here.
BB blinked, taken by surprise by the shouted response. He drifted forwards a few feet, squinting. Then, sure enough, Applebloom rounded the corner of the house, dressed in a t-shirt and blue jeans while carrying a red raincoat under her armpit. She raised her hand in a friendly wave.
Howdy. Sorry it took so long. Had to spend a few minutes looking for this thing.
She held up the raincoat. BB blinked a few times, then grinned and drifted closer to her.
Finally! Hi, Applebloom. How are you? I'm good. Now I'm kind of wondering why you called me over with such...
She glanced over at Eventide and raised an eyebrow.
Enthusiasm.
Eventide shrugged and jabbed his thumb in BB's direction. Let him explain. It's his big day. BB didn't wait for Applebloom to question it. He flew right up to her face, all but pressing his nose against hers.
Right, so, you know how Dad and I have been walking on the Everfree Park Trail a lot for a long time, right?
Applebloom leaned back slightly from the intrusion into her personal space, then nodded her head.
Yeah, I remember. Why?
BB did another backflip, this time out of sheer excitement.
I finally made it to the top without getting exhausted. We've been trying to get there for 2 years.
Applebloom's eyes widened up a bit, and her face lit up with a happy grin.
Wow, really? That's awesome, baby. Did you want to celebrate or something? I can call the girls. Actually...
BB cut her off, suddenly looking a little sheepish. He drifted back a few inches, his hooves starting to fidget over his chest.
I was kind of hoping it could be just you and me. I mean, I met you first. If I hadn't, then I never would have started trying to get stronger in the first place. In a way, I owe you.
Applebloom visibly hesitated for a moment, her head tilting to one side. She then gave a small nod, and a more reserved smile appeared on her lips.
All right, fair enough. What are you wanting to do?
BB relaxed somewhat and opened his mouth to speak. Before he could, however, A twinge of pain shot through his back and between his wings. His lungs tightened, and he dropped back to the ground with a thud. At once, he heard the two people coming up to his sides to make sure he was okay. He sucked in a deep breath and looked back up at them with a reassuring smile.
Sorry. I'm okay, just a little tired, a little sore. Nothing too bad.
Eventide and Applebloom exchanged worried looks before relenting. It was Eventide who spoke. All right, if you're sure, just take it easy, okay? We may have hit that milestone, but you can still have your fits if you aren't careful. BB nodded.
Right. I will.
He then turned to look up at Applebloom.
Anyways, I was thinking you could just go out into the woods and walk around for a while.
The farm girl looked at him for a few seconds, raising an eyebrow. After a moment, though, she smiled and stood upright again.
Sure. That sounds pretty relaxing, actually.
BB turned to his father, his eyes hopeful.
Can we, Dad?
Eventide looked between the two for a few seconds before nodding and ruffling BB's head. That's fine, yeah. Just make sure you come back before it starts raining, and be back before it gets dark, alright?
Right. Thanks, Dad.
BB chirped before launching himself forward and wrapping his hooves around Eventide's neck in a tight hug.
I love you.
I love you too. Now go have some fun. BB released his father, nodded, then turned around to head for the woods. He fell into step beside Applebloom, the two already launching into a conversation about all of the fun BB had had at the top of the mountain. They spent a good few hours out in those woods, meandering and talking to one another. The light of the sun had long since been obscured by the clouds, but the rain hadn't started to fall yet. Eventually, the duo found a nice spot to sit down, a ledge that overlooked a rocky outcropping further down. And there they sat, continuing to talk and reminisce. It was pleasant, and BB found it almost impossible to pull the smile off of his face. Not like he wanted to, of course. Smiling made Applebloom happy. And when she was happy, so was he. As their discussion carried on and on, though, BB's mind began to drift away. His attention on the conversation faltered, and he felt a subtle burning in his chest. It was growing more intense, and he felt the indescribable urge to gasp. Suddenly, he was knocked back to his senses when a hand on his shoulder shook him. Blinking in confusion, he looked over to see Applebloom looking back at him with some mild concern.
B? Y'all okay? You kinda went quiet on me.
He shook himself and nodded his head.
Yeah, sorry. Just zoned out, that's all.
He said in a lower voice than usual. Applebloom frowned, her aura shimmering with concern.
I guess that makes sense. You got a lot to think about. You were playing at the top of that trail for a while, weren't you? Uh-huh. Dad had to carry me back to make sure I didn't go into one of my fits.
BB explained, before looking ahead at the forest again.
Still, I'm having a hard time believing that I actually made it.
Applebloom's expression softened into a grin of pride. She lifted a hand and clapped BB on the back, right between his wings.
You've been at it for a long time. I'm super proud of you, B. Yeah. I've been trying to get to the top of that trail since you found me out here in the woods. You remember that? Shucks, how could I forget?
Applebloom rolled her eyes and nudged BB in the side with her elbow.
Just taking a casual stroll through the woods and finding a little kid all on his own with a hurt leg? Pretty memorable experience. It was memorable for me, too.
BB nodded along, his eyes slowly turning up towards the forest canopy.
It was the first time I turned into a human. And it was the day I made my first friend.
As he spoke, his eyes began to go distant with fond nostalgia.
It's hard to believe that it's been 2 years since then, huh? What's happened?
And harder to believe that y'all had us fooled about what you really looked like for so long,
Applebloom remarked with a certain mischievous glint in her eyes.
making us all think y'all were a real human boy. Shame on you.
Oh, quit it.
BB turned and lightly smacked her on the shoulder with a pout.
I had to deal with guilt over that for long enough. Don't go layering on more.
Instead of letting up, Applebloom reached over and yanked BB over with her arm, holding his head prisoner.
Oh, you're no fun. Fine then. I guess I'll just have to give you a hard time like this.
BB let out an indignant chitter when he felt Applebloom's knuckles rubbing into his head right above his horn.
Ow! Hey! Applebloom! Let me go!
He protested, his cheeks turning red from indignation.
Say the magic word.
Apples?
Applebloom paused, her expression flattening into a deadpan.
No.
A brief moment of disgruntlement provided BB the window he needed. With a grunt, he finally tugged himself free of his friend's hold and glared daggers at her. Completely unfazed by his bitter look, she just crossed her arms over her chest and gave him a wry smirk. The two stared at each other for a few minutes before the first cracks appeared in their facades. It began with a small twitch in BB's cheek, then a tremble in Applebloom's lip. After only a few more seconds, the two could hold it in no longer, and both broke into a fit of delighted giggles. Applebloom pulled herself together first. With her laughs dying down, she reached over and pulled BB more gently against her side in a warm hug. His laughs quieted down shortly after, and he happily returned the gesture. A quiet chitter of contentment could be heard from somewhere deep in his voice to go along with the affectionate nuzzle he gave her.
I'm real glad I met you,
he whispered to her, his eyes drifting closed. He took in a deep breath through his nose and then let it out in a content sigh. Applebloom glanced down at him for a second, then squeezed him closer with her own smile growing.
Ditto.
The two fell silent, enjoying one another's company and the fresh air. A breeze washed by, whistling softly between the trees and branches. The tranquility of that sound was, sadly, disturbed when a single drop of water splat against the back of his head. Frowning in displeasure, BB looked up at the sky. Another drop hit him right on his cheek, and somewhere far away, the low rumble of thunder rolled across the world.
Darn it. It's starting to rain,
he pointed out. Applebloom sighed and nodded her head.
Yep. Your dad wanted me to get you home if that started happening. Come on, let's hop to.
She relented before releasing BB from the hug and moving to stand. BB grumbled in annoyance and rose to his hooves. Suddenly, he froze. His entire body went rigid, his chest constricting and his throat tightening up. His eyes flew wide open, and the familiar sensation of exhaustion began to swallow him whole. He barely even had the presence of mind to put together that standing up like that must have been the last of his strength, before his legs gave out under him, and he fell forward.
What? Baby!
Applebloom's voice rang in his ears, and he heard her scrambling for him. He felt confused by this, until he realized that he was still falling. His vision focused for just a second, just long enough to see the pointed stones of the outcropping below flying up to meet him. Agony unlike anything BB had ever felt before suddenly exploded across his side where he hit the ground. His entire body jerked from the impact before rolling limply down and coming to a rest on the dirt. He might have screamed out, but his lungs were empty of air. His vision began to blur, all colors mixing together into vague, murky blobs. Sounds became muffled and distant, as if cotton were stuffed into his ears. His vision refocused for just a second, allowing him to look up. The rain was coming down harder now, pelting his body and everything around him, but that was of little consequence when compared to the ashen, horrified face of his friend high above him. Applebloom was on her hands and knees by the ledge, one palm covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide open, and her entire body was shaking. BB's vision began to blur again, and the last thing he heard was Applebloom screaming out his name at the top of her lungs. His tongue twitched at the faint taste of terror and despair. And then he knew no more.